There is a strange contradiction sitting at the center of almost every human life. We say we want to change, and yet the moment change actually arrives, something inside us pulls back, as if an invisible hand were gripping the wheel. High voltage, what if the very system that keeps you breathing, keeps your heart beating, keeps your body in balance, is the same system working against your transformation? Think of how many times a year begins with a promise. A gym membership, a fresh notebook, a quiet, private vow to finally become the person you've been picturing for years. And think of how often, within a matter of weeks, that promise quietly dissolves, not because you stopped caring, but because something deeper than caring took over. Gemstone, their mind knows the next step. Their body refuses to take it. Picture someone standing at the edge of a decision. A new job offer. A relationship that needs to end. A version of themselves just one choice away. This is not laziness. This is not a lack of willpower. This is something far older and far more intelligent than the story we usually tell ourselves about change. To understand why change feels so unbearably difficult, we need to go somewhere most people never think to look. Not into motivation, not into discipline, but into the architecture of survival itself, a system built over millions of years, long before words like ambition or self-improvement ever existed. Inside every living organism, there is a quiet, tireless process called homeostasis. It is the reason your body temperature stays close to 37 degrees Celsius even in a snowstorm or a heat wave. It is the reason your blood chemistry, your heart rate, your breathing, all hover within a narrow, protected range no matter what chaos unfolds around you. For billions of years, this stability has been the difference between life and death. An organism that could hold its internal world steady survived. One that couldn't, didn't. Nature rewarded consistency with continued existence, generation after generation, until stability itself became one of the deepest instincts a living creature could possess. But here is what almost no one tells you. Homeostasis does not stop at your body. It reaches into your habits, your beliefs, your relationships, even your sense of who you are. Your nervous system does not actually know the difference between a comfortable routine and a truly safe one. It only knows the difference between familiar and unfamiliar. And familiar, to a brain built by millions of years of evolution, has always meant one thing: survivable. If you did it yesterday and you're still alive today, your brain quietly files that behavior under safe, regardless of whether it makes you happy, healthy, or fulfilled. This is why a person can stay in a job they dislike for a decade, in a relationship that drains them, in a version of themselves they no longer recognize, not because they are weak, but because their nervous system has classified the discomfort as known, and known has always outranked better in the ancient logic of survival. Consider something as ordinary as the drive home from work. Most people could name a faster route if they thought about it for a moment, yet they take the same turns every single day, not because it's optimal, but because the sequence has become invisible, absorbed into a kind of muscle memory that no longer asks permission from conscious thought. Now imagine that same invisible loop, not guiding a car through familiar streets, but guiding an entire life through familiar patterns of thought, relationship, and self-worth. The brain was never designed to make you happy. It was designed to keep you alive. And those two goals are not always the same thing. Deep beneath the folds of your cerebral cortex sits a cluster of structures called the basal ganglia, along with a region called the striatum, working quietly to convert your repeated behaviors into something almost automatic. Neuroscientist and Graybiel spent decades studying this exact process, watching how the brain compresses long sequences of action, the drive to work, the late-night scrolling, the way you argue when you feel threatened, into tight, efficient loops. Once a behavior becomes a habit, it stops requiring much conscious thought at all. It becomes background code, running quietly beneath awareness. This is a remarkable feat of biological engineering. It frees your conscious mind from having to relearn how to walk, how to drive, how to speak, every single day. But it comes with a hidden cost. The brain does not just store your habits. It predicts your future using them. Every moment of your life, your brain is running a silent simulation, forecasting what is about to happen based almost entirely on what has happened before. This forecasting shows up in something researchers describe as prediction error, the gap between what the brain expects and what actually occurs. A small prediction error barely registers. But a large one, the kind produced when someone suddenly attempts a life dramatically different from the one their brain has modeled, floods the system with a kind of internal alarm. Not because anything dangerous is actually happening, but because the unfamiliar has always, throughout evolutionary history, carried the possibility of danger. When you attempt something new, whether it's waking up an hour earlier, speaking up in a meeting, or simply believing you deserve more than you currently have, your brain compares this new information against its existing model of you. And when the gap between who you are trying to become and who your brain expects you to be grows too wide, it does not interpret that gap as growth. It interprets it as error, as threat, as something to correct. This is the biological root of what so many people describe as self-sabotage. It is not sabotage in the way we usually imagine it, some hidden enemy working against our success. It is prediction. Your brain, doing exactly what it evolved to do, pulling you back toward the version of you it has already modeled as safe. But there is another layer to this resistance, one that lives not in neurons but in narrative. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We do not simply live our lives. We interpret them, and from that interpretation, we build a self-concept, a story about who we are that we carry with us into every room we enter. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced an idea that would reshape how we understand the human mind: cognitive dissonance. Festinger observed that when a person's actions, beliefs, or new information conflict with their existing self-image, it produces a genuine psychological discomfort, a kind of internal static the mind is desperate to resolve. And here is the unsettling part. The mind will often resolve that discomfort not by changing the belief, but by changing the behavior back to match it. If someone has spent 15 years believing they are simply not a disciplined person, and they suddenly begin waking up early, exercising, following through on their goals, that new behavior creates dissonance. Not because the new behavior is wrong, but because it contradicts the identity they have quietly defended for a decade and a half. And so, without any conscious decision, they begin to drift. They miss a day, then another, Slowly, almost gently, they are pulled back into the story that feels true, even if that story was never actually serving them. This is why willpower alone so rarely creates lasting change. You cannot out-discipline an identity. If the story beneath the behavior remains untouched, the behavior will eventually bend to match the story, no matter how much effort was spent trying to force it in the other direction. A person can white-knuckle a new routine for weeks, sometimes months, propped up entirely by force of will. But willpower is a finite resource, and the moment it runs low, the old identity is still standing there, patient, familiar, waiting to receive them back. We do not simply live our beliefs about ourselves. We defend them, even when they are quietly ruining our lives. There is a question worth sitting with, uncomfortable as it may feel. What if the very thing you say you want to escape is secretly offering you something you don't want to give up? Psychotherapists have long observed a phenomenon sometimes called secondary gain, the hidden, often unconscious benefits a person receives from a problem they consciously want to solve. The person who stays in chronic stress may be avoiding the vulnerability of rest. The person who never finishes their ambitious projects may be protecting themselves from ever being fully judged. The person who stays quiet in every relationship may be avoiding the risk of ever truly being seen, and possibly rejected. Sometimes we do not fear failure at all. We fear what success would demand of us, the visibility, the responsibility, the loss of a familiar excuse we've been leaning on for years. This is rarely conscious. No one wakes up and decides to sabotage their own life. But underneath the surface, the mind is constantly running a cost-benefit calculation, and sometimes staying stuck, painful as it is, feels statistically safer than stepping into the complete unknown of who you might become. Psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, studying a pattern they called imposter phenomenon, found something similar hiding inside the lives of highly capable people. Even after clear, undeniable success, many of their subjects remained convinced they had somehow fooled everyone around them. What looked from the outside like unwarranted anxiety was often something else entirely. A private fear that visibility itself was dangerous, that being fully seen might finally expose the parts of themselves they had spent a lifetime hiding. Viktor Frankl, writing from the wreckage of unimaginable suffering, observed something profound about the human need for meaning even inside pain. Suffering, he argued, becomes bearable the moment we can locate a reason for it. And so even dysfunction, given enough time, can start to feel meaningful simply because it is familiar, simply because we have built an entire identity around surviving it. This tension between the pull of the familiar and the ache for something more is not new. It runs through nearly every era of human thought. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus is remembered for a single haunting observation. No one steps into the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. Change, he understood, is not the exception to existence. It is the very fabric of it. And yet human beings, for all of recorded history, have built entire civilizations, religions, and personal identities around the desperate attempt to hold something still. Centuries later, the Stoic philosophers would arrive at a strikingly similar conclusion from a different direction entirely. They taught that suffering rarely comes from events themselves, but from our resistance to their nature, our refusal to accept that change is simply what existence does. To resist change, in their view, was to resist reality itself, a battle no one has ever truly won. In the 20th century, psychologist Carol Dweck uncovered something remarkably similar hiding inside modern classrooms. Studying how children respond to challenge and failure, she identified two contrasting mindsets: a fixed mindset, in which ability is seen as a static trait, something you either have or don't, and a growth mindset, in which ability is understood as something built through effort and time. Children with a fixed mindset didn't just fail more often when faced with difficulty. They avoided difficulty altogether, because failure felt like proof of a fixed, unchangeable truth about who they were. Change doesn't just ask you to do something different. It asks you to risk discovering that the story you've told about yourself might have been wrong all along. That risk, more than any lack of ambition, is what keeps so many people circling the same patterns for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes, telling themselves it is simply their nature, when it was, all along, only their history. If resistance to change is built into biology, identity, and even the architecture of meaning itself, does that mean change is impossible? The evidence, thankfully, says otherwise. But it also tells us that change rarely happens the way we've been taught to pursue it. Change does not usually arrive through a single burst of motivation, a dramatic decision made at midnight, powerful as that moment might feel. Motivation is a spark, not a fuel source. What actually reshapes the brain's predictions over time is repetition, small and consistent enough that the nervous system stops registering it as a threat. The brain does not resist a single new behavior nearly as fiercely as it resists a sudden new identity. This is why gradual, almost boring consistency tends to outperform dramatic transformation. Each small repetition is a quiet piece of evidence submitted to the brain's internal model, slowly updating its prediction of who you are. Not through force, but through familiarity, the same mechanism that once held you in place, now rebuilt to carry you somewhere new. Journalist and author James Clear captured this shift elegantly, describing identity change not as the finish line of new behavior, but as its origin point. Each time you act in alignment with a new identity, however small the act, you cast a vote for the person you are becoming. No single vote changes the outcome, but an accumulation of votes, cast consistently over time, eventually rewrites the story your own mind believes about you. There is also something to be said for the role of environment, often underestimated in conversations about willpower. A person surrounded by cues of their old identity, the same chair, the same late-night scrolling, the same conversations that reinforce the same self-image, will find change nearly impossible, no matter how strong their intentions. But even small shifts in environment can quietly lower the resistance the brain puts up, making the unfamiliar feel just slightly more survivable. A different room to work in. A different route through the day. A different circle of conversation. Each one, small as it seems, removes a cue the old identity was quietly relying on to reassert itself. There is also the matter of pace. Psychologist Robert Boyce, studying newly hired academics, once found that the ones who succeeded were not the ones who worked in exhausting sporadic bursts, but the ones who showed up in small, unremarkable increments, consistently, almost without drama. Transformation, it turns out, rarely looks like the dramatic before and after stories we're sold. It looks, most days, like almost nothing at all. You do not become a new person by demanding it. You become a new person by living, in small unremarkable moments, as though you already are one. Perhaps the reason change feels so difficult is not because something is broken inside you. It is because everything inside you is working exactly as it was built to work, protecting a version of yourself that once helped you survive, even if it no longer helps you live. The nervous system that resists your growth is the same one that has kept you breathing through every hardship you've already faced. The identity that clings to old patterns is the same one that gave you a sense of continuity in a world that never stops shifting beneath your feet. Even resistance, in its own strange way, is a form of care, misapplied to a moment it no longer understands. But Heraclitus was right. You cannot step into the same river twice. The version of you reading these words is already, in some small way, different from the one who began watching this video. Every thought you've absorbed here has left a trace, a small piece of evidence submitted quietly to the brain's ongoing prediction of who you are. Change was never meant to happen all at once, in a single act of defiance against your own biology. It happens the way rivers carve canyons, not through force, but through the patient repetition of something small, returning again and again, until what once felt impossible simply becomes the shape of who you are now. So perhaps the question was never why change feels so difficult. Perhaps the real question is this: what small, unremarkable act, repeated quietly enough for long enough, are you finally ready to let become true?